Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Forge of Freedom podcast, where we discuss principles of liberty, personal responsibility, and the pursuit of a virtuous life. I'm your host, Alex Ooley, and today I'm happy to be joined by a special guest, Lawrence Reed, to discuss Poland's pivotal role in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Larry is President Emeritus of the Foundation for Economic Education. He's also a renowned economist, historian, and a champion of freedom. Larry's deep connection to Poland, from witnessing its resistance to Soviet rule in 1986 to praising its historic outpouring of assistance to Ukraine in 2023, makes him the perfect voice to guide us through this story. Poland's past is a story of resilience forged through Nazi occupation, Soviet oppression, and Cold War defiance. Today, that legacy drives its stand against Russian aggression in Ukraine. With Larry, we'll explore how Poland's history shapes its actions, welcoming millions of refugees, delivering vital military aid, and how it balances moral conviction with the hard realities of living next to Russia as a NATO member. We'll also go deeper by asking, how does Poland view Russia's threat to liberty in Eastern Europe? What does its leadership mean for the region and the fight against authoritarianism? Larry's insights, rooted in his love for Poland and its heroes like Witold Pilecki, will reveal what this nation's grit teaches us about courage and freedom. Looking ahead, what lessons can Poland's example forge for Americans and the world? And what would Larry say to the Polish people directly? This is the Forge of Freedom, where we sharpen our understanding of liberty through the fire of real-world experience. With that said, Larry, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Alex. It's a great pleasure to be on your show again. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and we were just reminiscing a little bit, I guess, that you were on the show. It didn't seem like it, but nearly 2 years ago now, July 2023, episode 40, where we discussed your book, Are We Good Enough for Liberty? And that this episode actually was my dad's idea. That was shortly when we recorded that episode, shortly before you received the award in Poland, the Grand Cross of the Order of Merit of the Republic of Poland. And so that kept you, I believe, at top of mind for my dad. And he said, you should ask Larry to come on the podcast to discuss the current conflict and the perspective that Poland has, or that you have with respect to Poland as it relates to Ukraine and Russia. So I'm excited about this episode. I thought it was a great idea, and I reached out to you, and you said, of course, it sounds like a good topic for discussion. So here we are. But if you would, just for those who maybe don't recall or didn't start listening to the podcast as early as episode 40, tell us a little bit about your connection to Poland. Obviously, you're an American. You live in Georgia, but you have a special connection to Poland. Can you tell us a little bit about that just to start out?
I'd be happy to. There was a period of about a decade in my life when I was running some other think tanks in a couple places, one in Idaho, one in Michigan. But during that period, I had time when I could pursue my interests in freelance journalism. And I chose to use that time, for the most part, in going to Iron Curtain countries to experience the underground movements in those countries, the people who were courageously resisting the communist regimes there. And one of those places was Poland, and that was in November of 1986. So I've had a connection to Poland since that trip, that one in particular, and I've been to Poland many times since. But that first one, when the communists were still in power, left a very deep impact on me as I saw firsthand what the oppressed peoples of that country were doing to resist communist rule. I was very impressed with their courage and how effective they were.
So tell us, I know one of the things that came about as a result of your time there was what's now called the Blinking Lights Project. Could you tell us a little bit about what brought about that project? That's a project that I believe that FEE still has and is basically a recognition or remembrance of one of the experiences you had in Poland.
Yes, in that trip in 1986, when I spent time with the underground and stayed at a different home every night to stay a step ahead of the government, one night there was a couple I was introduced to, in their apartment. They had run underground radio for Solidarity, the old, some say trade union, but it was much more than that. It was a pro-democracy, anti-communist organization as well. But they had run underground radio for Solidarity in the Warsaw area until they were captured and given several years in jail. And when I was interviewing them, and they were out of jail, but very active again in various ways, resisting the regime, one question that I asked was, when you were broadcasting, how did you know if people were listening? And that's when Sophia, who was still living, answered this way. She said, well, we could only broadcast 8 or 10 minutes at a time, and then we had to go off the air to avoid detection, tear down the radio, take it someplace else, set it up again, and then broadcast for another 8 to 10 minutes. And she said one night while we were broadcasting, we asked people on the air, if you believe in the message of this radio, in freedom for Poland, please blink your lights. And she then said, we went to the window, and for hours, all of Warsaw was blinking. Well, that was a very courageous couple. He went on to, when the communists were kicked out, to serve in the lower house and in the Senate in Poland. And she, in her mid-80s now, is a top advisor to the outgoing Polish president, Andrzej Duda. And it turned out, I found when I went to Poland to accept the award you mentioned, that she was one of the people who petitioned the president to give that award to me. But at FEE, we think that their example, the Romaszewskis, their example of courageously broadcasting a message of freedom for their countrymen is something that shouldn't be forgotten, and that it was well worth naming a project for. And over the years, we have given a Blinking Lights Award, we call it, to courageous people in various parts of the world who have done something to take a stand for freedom at great risk to themselves.
I get goosebumps on my arms every time I hear or read that story. It's just amazing to try to think about looking out the window and seeing all of those blinking lights. This is the
Yeah.
seeing the fruits of your effort and the incredible risk that they were taking by running this underground radio operation. So that's an incredible story. If you would just tell us a little bit about, obviously you're very familiar with Poland's history. You've written many articles and told stories about. I apologize. You'll correct me if I'm wrong. Alluded to the story of Witold Pilecki. Is that how you say his name?
Actually, Witold
Witold
Pilecki.
Pilecki. Okay, wow. I
Pilecki.
really got
Yeah,
that wrong. So I'm glad we got that out of the way up front.
yeah.
You talked about his story on a number of occasions, but if you would talk a little bit about how these examples of courage in Poland of resisting oppression, whether it was Nazi occupation or Soviet communism, how do you see this experience or these examples shaping their current stance with the conflict between Russia and Ukraine?
I think resistance to tyranny is very much in the Polish DNA, and it goes way back, long before this past century, when Poland reappeared on the map again in 1918 for the first time in 123 years. Uh, Poland had one of the freest societies in Europe from the 15th century until the 1790s, about 250 years, when the country was called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Very free place, complete freedom of religion, a limited government, and just a real beacon for Europe. But in the 1790s, Poland's neighbors, Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Prussia, connived to carve the country up. And the Russians from the east moved in, and there was what is known as the partitions of Poland. And for the next 123 years, it wasn't on the map. It had been absorbed by those three neighboring powers. And the Russian occupation in particular was especially brutal. In the 19th century, when most of this occupation by the Russians was taking place, Moscow tried, or St. Petersburg at the time, they tried to take the Polish culture out of the Poles. They wanted to Russify Poland. They wanted to wipe out all vestiges of things Polish. And the Poles were dead set against that, of course. They didn't just roll over. They went underground in great numbers. And even Maria Sklodowska, whom we know in the West as Marie Curie, the only woman to win two Nobel Prizes in two different sciences. She even earned her undergraduate degree in an illegal underground university in Poland during Russian occupation. So they have a rich history in Poland of resisting occupying powers and the Russians in particular. And of course, you look at more recent history, when Poland reappeared on the map as a result of the end of World War I, that was in 1918, the Versailles Treaty, recarved a new Poland and said now the country exists again. The first thing they had to fight was a Russian invasion under Lenin, the Bolshevik who brought communism to Russia in 1917. Well, the Poles successfully repelled that. And when they won the famous Battle of Warsaw in 1921, we could effectively say that the red tide that Lenin was hoping to swamp Western Europe with was rolled back. We owe a great debt of gratitude to the Poles for resisting Lenin in 1920 and 21. So, they had this long history. And then, of course, after World War II, the Russians didn't leave when they moved in from the east to help conquer Hitler. They stayed and imposed a Soviet puppet regime of communism from Moscow. So the Poles have a long history of resisting the Russians and a good reason to dislike Russian regimes.
My father, actually, both of my parents visited Poland a couple of years ago, and somebody while they were there made the comment to them that the Soviet occupation was far more brutal, or they were treated far worse than they were by the Nazis.
Yeah.
And of course, I've never been to Poland. I actually know very little, especially as compared to you, about Polish history. But there's such an emphasis in American history, especially in government schools, on World War II, with this focus on the Nazi regime, and very little about information about what the Soviets were up to. And of course, there are lots of people who speculate that maybe that's because they don't want to give bad press to the communist ideals.
Yeah,
But
because they're kissing cousins in some
yeah,
cases.
right.
I'm amazed to this day how many young people don't know that World War II was started not just by the Nazis, but by the Nazis and the Soviets, who had secretly agreed in late August of 1939 to invade Poland, Hitler from the west and Stalin from the east, divide the country, do the same with the Baltic states, and that's what they did. And so Stalin and Hitler were both allies and co-conspirators in starting the Second World War.
I totally agree with you. I think very few young people my age, people younger than me, would understand that. I guess one of the questions I have is, do you have any insight as to the brutality of the Soviet occupation in Poland as compared to how the Nazis treated the Polish people?
It was every bit as brutal as you suggested, Alex. And this is not by accident. I have a lot of friends in Russia and ordinary Russian people I have great sympathy and empathy for. But Russian governments have notoriously had brutality as a key element of their wartime strategy. It isn't just soldiers on their own going out and doing bad things. It's been part of Russian government policy going back over multiple regimes, where to secure your hold on an enemy's territory, you have to not just take control of the battlefield and beat the army, you have to brutalize the people. And so they historically do that. And that means everything from torture and rape of women to forced hunger and starvation. I mean, the Russian army over several regimes, separate from the great majority, I think, of Russian people, but the Russian army has really been a bunch of thugs over and over again.
And not only to impose their own governance, right, but that's common among communist regimes in
Yes.
particular, to enforce the ideals of communism. They have to force them through violence to
That's right.
impose
And
these
because,
ideals.
they don't believe in that there's a hereafter or that there is a creator. And so they're not going to be accountable for whatever they do. So, hey, anything goes. Let's do what we have to do, take over the territory and take their stuff. That's been their philosophy.
Yeah. Yeah. So we've alluded to your experience there during your time in 1986, where you witnessed the underground resistance to Soviet rule. firsthand. Do you see parallels between what was going on then with their struggle against the Soviets and today with Poland's support for Ukraine against the Russian regime?
I do. I see it as a continuation of a well deserved hostility toward the Russians for things like invasions and occupations and impositions of stupid communistic and or socialistic rule over their neighbors. And of course, it's a continuation of Polish courage. They are among the most courageous people, I think, in the world. You cannot survey Polish history, at least that of the last several hundred years, without coming across endless, remarkable individuals who put everything on the line on behalf of independence for their country, freedom for their people. That's a streak that I think is part of the Polish DNA.
Well, and speaking of which, this is a little out of order. I gave you a brief outline of how we might go about this discussion, but I wanted to get at some point to the discussion of Polish heroes, and we've already alluded to Witold Pilecki a couple of times. If you would tell his story, what's significant about his example of courage?
Okay, Witold Pilecki is probably the most courageous person I've ever learned of, or certainly one of them. He was born in 1901, as I recall, and he served in the First World War. He also fought the Soviets in that brief war I alluded to after Poland became a country again in 1918. He was decorated for his bravery. And then after Poland expelled Lenin and the Bolsheviks by 1921, Pilecki settled down and started a family, became a well-known figure in his part of Poland. He was a successful businessman and philanthropist even at a young age. And then when Hitler invaded in 9, and 3 weeks later Stalin invaded Poland from the other side, Pilecki said goodbye to his family and joined the resistance and fought both the Nazis and the Soviets. About a year into that, the Polish resistance realized that the Nazis were building some massive, sprawling complex near Krakow in southern Poland. And they had reason to believe that some of their men were being taken there. They didn't know exactly what was planned for this enormous facility, but they needed somebody on the inside to find out. And Pilecki is one of the few, if not only person that we know of who volunteered to get arrested by the Germans in the hope that they might not shoot him, instead perhaps send him to this place called Auschwitz so he could find out what was going on from the inside. Well, he got his wish. He got arrested, and the Germans threw him in this place that the Poles wanted to know more about. And Pilecki saw it firsthand. It's the most notorious Nazi concentration camp in all of Europe. And he was in there enduring unbelievably awful conditions for nearly 3 years. Then, during that time, he and the friends he made who he could confide in, they smuggled documents out. They helped a couple people escape, and they even broadcast from a crude radio transmitter for a time. And the combination of Pilecki's radio broadcasts from inside Auschwitz, the documents he smuggled out, the eyewitness account he provided later, all of that became collectively known as Witold's Report. And much of it was the first comprehensive eyewitness account of what was going on inside that notorious Nazi concentration camp, where somewhere between 1 million and 2 million people were killed. After the war, you'd think he'd say, okay, I need to get back to my family. And he did have a brief time with them before the Polish army realized, hey, the Soviets don't look like they want to leave. And so they enlisted Pilecki to spy on the Soviets, which he did for the next 2 years until his cover was blown. And he was arrested, put on a very public show trial. You can see clips of it, in fact, on YouTube to this day. And ultimately, the Soviets executed him in 1948. So, but here's a man who put everything on the line for the freedom of his people against two rotten regimes. The communist regime in Poland after the Second World War forbade any mention, any public mention of his name. Even his family could not mention his name in public. And you might think, well, why would that be? Because you'd think they love for people to know about what he did against the Nazis. But you can't tell that story without also telling what he did against the Soviets. And they didn't want that out. And so, not until 1989, when the communists were thrown out, was his name allowed to be spoken publicly. And now there are memorials to him, films made about him all over Poland. Every Pole knows who he was and is extremely appreciative of the service that he provided for Polish freedom.
Speaking of memorials, films, books, do you have any resources or recommendations for people who want to know more about his story?
Yes, you can get a copy of Witold's Report, Witold apostrophe S, on Amazon for sure, I know, because that's where I got mine. But there's also more recently a film that is in English, or at least has English subtitles, that I thought was quite good. And Witold is in the name of the film. I can't remember the full thing, but if you look on Prime Video, or maybe it was Netflix, I don't recall which, one of those two, type in his first name, maybe his last name as well, Pilecki. You can find that film, and the actor who plays him looks extraordinarily like him as well. I never met him, of course, since he was killed in 1948, but I did have an evening with his son, Andres, who now in his 90s is still living and remembers very well his father's trial. He was a teenager when he was able to go to the trial to see these terrible accusations against his father, who did not run from them. He didn't say, "No, I didn't commit espionage." He essentially said, "Yes, I did, and I would do it again." And the Soviets didn't like that.
Well, he never wavered in his courage.
He didn't.
It's incredible. A truly
Yeah,
incredible story. I will try to link to those, and I may follow up with you actually by email after the show to see if you can find that
I'm sure I
film.
can. I can send it
Yeah.
to you.
And I'll put that in the show notes so that people have easy access to it with the episode here. And then there's obviously, I want to recommend you plug your book as well. Real Heroes, I think, is a great resource for folks as well.
Thank
That's
you.
not specific to his story, but I think nevertheless, I think a story about incredible acts of courage by other
Yes, and
people as well.
Pilecki is one of the 40 chapters in that book.
Right. So I'll certainly link to that book as well so that people can check
Thank
out
you.
your book about that. One thing you mentioned, speaking of Witold's report, was that I think it was in one of your articles that I read. I don't recall. I'll try to link to those as well. But that his report was one of the first, if not the first, account of what was going on in these concentration camps and these extermination camps to the outside world. Right, his
Right.
efforts, whether it was through people who were smuggling his letters or his reports or other sources, were some of the first accounts about what was going on because most of the outside world had no idea.
Yes.
What were some of the mechanisms that he used to get out the word? There were couriers and smugglers. Did he have special connections, or how did he go about that? Do you have any insight into that?
Well, for any of your viewers who may have seen any episodes from Hogan's Heroes, remember that comedy from, what was it, maybe even 60s, 70s at the latest? Some of those awful places that the Nazis ran also leaked like a sieve sometimes. Some of their own soldiers collaborated with some of the prisoners when they realized what these awful things were that were going on. Very small minority did. But Pilecki and his men would, whenever they had any reason to be in or near a place in the camp where there were documents held, they would look for opportunities to get in, get what they could, and get out. And a few were caught and executed. And Pilecki had reason finally, just before he escaped, to believe that they were close to him, but he got out before they could nail him. So smuggling documents out, before Pilecki, there were over 100 people in Auschwitz who did successfully escape. And some of those were carrying the documents that Pilecki's people had rounded up inside the camp. But then I mentioned that radio. He and his people inside the camp built a crude radio transmitter. And for about 6 months of their incarceration, they were actually secretly, during the night, using that crude radio transmitter to broadcast to the outside world of what they knew, what they saw, what was going on inside Auschwitz. And then, of course, after he escaped, and in that summer of 1945, before he started going underground again to spy on the Soviets, he really spilled the beans, and others did as well, and the world found out. But the earliest reports in the mid 40s were coming from people like Pilecki about these awful camps.
He was certainly a light for liberty and an incredible darkness. I think
Yeah.
that I like that imagery. Of course, I think that's captured by the Blinking Lights project. And also, there was an article I read recently by Ryan McMakin over at the Mises Institute. The title of the article is that our job is to build fires in the darkness. And
Yes.
I think I love that imagery. And I
Mhm.
think that Pilecki is an incredible example of that.
Yeah, it's reminiscent of Sam Adams of the Sons of Liberty in the American Revolution. He talked about lighting brush fires for liberty.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's I love that sort of imagery and the example that Pilecki said of that unwavering courage at every level. It's hard to imagine that I would be capable of that sort of courage. I like to hope that I could be, but it's certainly something to try to emulate if the circumstances require it.
Yeah, most people, I don't know if I could have mustered that kind of courage. Most people probably couldn't, which underscores all the more the importance of celebrating those who do come forward, like the Pileckis of the world, muster that kind of courage. We cannot forget them. We should celebrate them. If we want to see more people of greater courage come forth when the time is called for, we can't forget those who did. And the best way to bring forth more is to celebrate and express appreciation for the people who did it themselves in the past.
Well, and for that reason, that's one of the reasons I love your book, Real Heroes, because it gives people the sort of the archetype to follow, the motivation to see that courageous actions can be incredible forces for good in the
Yes,
world and for freedom. So I want to bring our discussion a little bit to the current conflict in Ukraine, the war of aggression by Russia in Ukraine. I know you expressed, I think the words you used were historic outpouring of assistance. You praised the assistance that Poland was giving to Ukraine. And of course, there's been a lot of discussion about the war in Ukraine, especially with the election of Donald Trump and his rhetoric saying that, this is something that would never have started if I had been president when the war started. Obviously, there's some internal conflict, even in the libertarian world, about what should be done in Ukraine. Could you tell us a little bit about how you see Poland's role and what was behind your comment there about the praise for outpouring assistance to Ukraine by Poland?
sure. For America and Americans, the conflict in Ukraine seems, thousands of miles away, and there's a legitimate debate going on about, well, how vital is what happens there to U.S. security. But the Poles are on the front lines. They are right next door, and they have this long history of resisting Russian aggression. And they also know fully well, as Ukrainian President Zelensky pointed out a few weeks ago in Washington, that Putin has no history of truth telling. He has broken ceasefires and agreements with lots of countries over and over again. His first priority is rebuilding the old Russian Empire as much as he can during his time. And I don't think he has any objections to doing anything to achieve that. So, Poland being right next door, they're thinking, holy cow, this is, today Ukraine, tomorrow maybe us if he thinks he has a chance. The Baltic states of Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, they too have really stepped up to the plate and have been of immense help to Poland or to Ukraine. But Poland has gone the extra mile. They've accepted somewhere between 1.5 million and 2 million Ukrainian refugees. And the most remarkable thing about that is that when those Ukrainian refugees were pouring into Poland 2 and 3 years ago, they didn't go into refugee camps. There were no camps full of tents and homeless people living in tents in the freezing cold, because Poles took those Ukrainians into their homes. And in the last year and a half, I've been back to Poland 3 times, and I've raised this every time. And because I wanted to know, are Ukrainians still staying in uh, the homes of private Polish people? A few are, but I was told time and again, no, most of the Ukrainians, we've freed up our labor markets so that it's easier to start a business. It's easier to go to work for whatever wage you can get in our markets. And as a result, Ukrainians have moved on from Polish homes to their own flats, and some have done quite well even beyond that. But just think of that. To take a country of fewer than 40 million people takes in as many as 2 million in very short order, doesn't build camps, but accepts them in private homes. What a remarkable outpouring of humanitarian relief. And it's good to know now that most of those Ukrainians have found employment and found housing on their own inside Poland and other places.
That says a lot about the hospitality of the
Yeah.
Polish people. If you could give us a little insight, what is Poland's relationship like with Ukraine prior to the war in Ukraine?
Well,
What was it, a friendly relationship, or were they seen as outsiders, so to speak,
for the
Ukrainians?
most part, over the last 130 years, Poland and Ukraine have been friends. There have been a few moments of some tension, but that's the way life is in all corners of the world. By and large, they've been very good friends. Poland feels as though what Ukrainians are going through is very much what they'll go through if Putin is allowed to succeed in Ukraine. So I know that after 3 years of this, everybody's a little weary, but I think Poles are still of the view that Putin has to be resisted at whatever cost because he's not going to settle just for what he can get from Ukraine. And it would be a very valuable lesson for the world if Putin gets a bloody nose. And of course, Ukrainians have done a remarkable job at that so far. But for him to be defeated on the battlefield would send a powerful, positive signal all over the world. Well, not to belabor the point, but as you might imagine, I can't stand the guy either.
Sure. Well, I'm curious. You've made the point, and I believe this point or agree with you on this point that you can't take Putin at his word.
Yeah,
That I think he has said on a few occasions at least that he doesn't believe he can remake the Soviet Union to what it was prior to its fall, and that would basically be a suicide mission for Russia. I believe that I heard that in his interview with Tucker Carlson. What is it about Putin that makes you think or assert that you can't take him at his word? Because I think this is an important point, right, in terms of
yeah,
whether or not there should be some sort of agreement or resolution through diplomacy or through battle, through
yeah.
war.
Well, he's been in power now for what, a little over 2 decades, and he has invaded Ukraine now twice. He's invaded Georgia. He has threatened other neighbors. I really don't think he intends to rebuild the entire old Soviet Union. I mean, that would involve even the uh, Asian states like Kazakhstan or what have you. I don't think he's dumb enough to think he could ever do that. But when it comes to Europe, I think he has has it in his mind that Russia has to be a bulwark against the free countries of Europe and the United States. And he clearly doesn't want Ukraine to be a NATO member. And I realize on that question, there are pros and cons, but can you blame the Ukrainians for wanting to be a part of NATO when they themselves were invaded by the Russians, actually a third time? I'm thinking way back in the 20s. And then the Russians imposed Soviet communism on them and then invaded in 2014 and then again in 2022. So I can understand why they want to be a part of NATO. But Putin has this, he's had power now so long. What else is there for him to do? And he's got a very restive population with domestic economic problems. He probably felt when he invaded Ukraine, he could rally the people of Russia behind him, get them to ignore their troubles and focus on Ukraine. I think that's wearing thin, from what I understand, inside Russia. But hey, you give somebody the kind of power that Putin has, if they're not already nuts, they're going to go nuts because power does that to people. And who knows all the things that may have gone on in his mind when he invaded Ukraine. I mean, he claimed that he was going to denazify a country run by a Jewish president. I mean, how nuts is that? So anyway, I just hope that all this process right now about peace will not result in a sellout to Putin and abandonment of Ukraine. We'll have to see. But I don't trust Putin as far as I could spit.
I'm curious, what does Poland think about, when I say Poland, obviously, what does a majority of the population there think about including Ukraine in NATO? Do they think that that's a dangerous act that would be seen as an act of aggression by Russia, and therefore it's not in Poland's best interest to do that? Or would they prefer to add Ukraine to NATO? Do you have any sense about what the
I
public
don't
perception is
have
there?
I had not seen any polls on that, pardon the pun, but I think that if I had to guess, I would say most polls would probably want Ukraine in NATO. Some might say maybe there's a better time to do it than right now, but I think ultimately there's probably more sentiment for Ukraine in NATO in Poland than there is on the other side. That's my guess, but I haven't seen any actual polls on the question.
Because when we're talking about whether or not we can take Putin at his word, I agree with you. I don't know that we can believe him when he says this is only as far as I'll go and that's it. But I do believe him when he says that the expansion of NATO he sees as an act of aggression. And so the question I suppose is, whether or not it's in Poland or the rest of Europe's best interest to allow Ukraine into NATO for that reason. So I know it's difficult to assess that in terms of all of Europe because every European country is different. But that seems like a very important and sensitive question for Poland in particular, since they are much closer in proximity to Russia than most of Europe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know when you look at a map, something as sterile as just a map of Europe, you might say, look at all these countries now that are part of NATO and they're buttoned up against Russia. And so obviously Russia feels threatened. But when you look at the reality, I mean, there is no credible case that the European powers in NATO represent some imminent threat of invasion of Russia. I mean, it's a defensive alliance. And so Putin can squawk all he wants. But I think it's really silly to say NATO's just bristling, waiting to cross the border and occupy this gigantic 11 time zone country called Russia. I just think that's ridiculous. He ought to get that out of his head because it's absurd. And of course, if he had any sympathy for the plight of his neighbors, he would understand that they have good reason to want to be defended one way or the other against Russia. Because Russia has been, its government has been a thug regime for decades upon decades. They invade their neighbors, they threaten, so gee, I'm sorry, all these Eastern European countries that used to be subjugated by the Soviets, they all have good reason to fear what goes on in Moscow. They never invaded Moscow. Moscow has invaded them. And so they want defense. And I think they have a stronger case for it than Russia does.
We've been talking a little bit about public sentiment in Poland as it relates to the inclusion of Ukraine in NATO. But I want to talk a little bit about public sentiment in a different regard. Obviously, there's an incredible amount of disagreement among American people about whether or not the United States should be involved in some capacity in the war in Ukraine. What's the public sentiment in Poland about what Poland should be doing with respect to Ukraine? Is it, I suspect anyway that it's there's a more universal agreement there than there is here.
Well, there was one party who had been long in power in Warsaw when the Soviets invaded, Russia invaded in 2022. Now there's a different government as a result of elections last year, but both of them have been strongly supportive of resisting Russian aggression. So I think that's probably reflective of the fact that most Poles, although they're weary of the war, I'm sure, most Poles are quite bright eyed about what the Putin threat really means. And they think it needs to be stopped one way or the other. So I don't think that's wavered very much, even under a new party in power in Warsaw since last November.
One other regard with respect to public sentiment, obviously the EU depends largely on American involvement and American funding, American weapons for defense. How does Poland view the United States in terms of the United States role and responsibility, to the extent the United States has any responsibility? Do they believe that the EU should step up its game and the rest of NATO, or do they sort of want to lean on the United States like many of the EU members?
Well, I think Poland does want the Europeans to step up to the plate more. And Poland certainly has. They are either at or maybe even above what NATO members have committed to in terms of the portion of their GDP that goes to defense. The Poles have been incredibly generous in war materiel and as well as humanitarian aid to the Ukrainians. And so, yeah, I know that they would like to see Britain and Germany and France step up to the plate and do more too. And I agree with that. I think they should too. This is in their wheelhouse or their neck of the woods. And those countries, I think, do need to do more. That's one of the good things that Trump seems to be accomplishing, whether for good or for ill on other matters like U.S. role. He has prompted the European NATO countries to feel as though they better step up to the plate because the U.S. can't be relied upon to carry so much of the burden on this. That's a good thing. I think those countries need to do more.
Yeah, the common refrain is that 300 million Americans are asked to defend 500 million Europeans, and
Yeah,
that doesn't seem fair. And I think that there's truth in that, and I hope that Trump is able to get the European countries to step up their game for their own defense.
yeah,
Um,
and another thing we ought to be throwing out there is we ought to be reminding Europe that maybe one of the reasons that your own defense seems to be so expensive to you is that you've squandered so much money on building up these welfare states. You've kind of forgotten what your primary purpose is as governments, which is to defend your own people. So scale back your welfare states if you need the money to defend yourselves.
in fact, I haven't read it. I saw that you shared I believe it was a book today about dependency. And so the governments there have done more to foster dependency than they have
Yeah.
to focus on the defense of their people, right?
Yeah.
And so that they often criticize the United States for being antiquated and out of touch with modern reality, that in the fact that we don't have so many of the welfare programs and policies that they have. But that's largely because we pay for our defense as well as their defense to a
Yeah.
large degree.
They're not flat on their backs like they were at the end of World War II. They are, for the most part, among the richest countries in the world. They can afford it.
Yeah, yeah. So one of the things that you described Russia as an evil regime in the context of the Ukrainian invasion, but Ukraine itself is not exactly a bastion of liberty itself. How do you reconcile those two two things?
Yeah, Ukraine is far from perfect. And in terms of internal liberties, it probably uh, has retreated since the war started from where it was even before the war began. That's unfortunate. That's not an uncommon thing. I mean, even America during World War One, in particular, we President Wilson, who was perhaps our worst president ever, he imposed all kinds of controls on not just the economy, but also on dissent, on differences of opinion. And I wouldn't have said to anybody that America in 1917, after Wilson was clamping down like that, wasn't worth defending because there was always the hope that this wouldn't last, that we'd get rid of Wilson, rather. Yeah, we can get rid of him too. That would be nice. But we would restore lost liberties after the war. I would be the last person to say Ukraine is a bastion of honesty or that it doesn't have a lot of corruption. I'm sure it does. And that's very lamentable. But if you think it has a lot of corruption now, just imagine how much there would be if Russia were to take it over and then pose a greater threat to other countries as well. So, the world is a messy place and you can't always have everything your way at any given moment.
And I think the other important distinction too is that Ukraine, for all its faults, has not been an aggressor on the world
Yeah,
stage.
that's right. Yeah.
And so, to the extent that it's worthy to defend Ukraine, or worthy for whether that's the United States or European countries who have a much greater interest in Ukraine, you're at least defending a more or less peaceful country,
Yeah,
even
as
if
long as
even though
Ukraine's been in existence, certainly since the fall of the Soviet Empire, it hasn't threatened any neighbors. So we can't forget that. And also in the mid 90s, under pressure from the United States, Ukraine gave up the nuclear weapons that were still on its soil as a leftover from the communism days. They gave up those nuclear weapons. I'll bet a lot of Ukrainians wish today they hadn't done that. And I'm an American who wishes the US government hadn't pressed them to do that, because I'll bet a nuclear armed Ukraine would not have been invaded by Vladimir Putin.
and we were talking early in the show about the lack of knowledge about the dynamics that brought about World War II in the invasion of Poland. But one thing that's always, I was ashamed that I didn't know about it until earlier in life, but Holodomor, and I think I'm
Yeah.
saying that correctly, about
Holodomor.
how awful that was as basically a crime against humanity, from the confiscation of grain. Would you actually, a lot of people, a lot of our listeners may not know what it is. Would you mind to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, the Holodomor, which is the uh, famine, man-made famine imposed upon Ukraine by Stalin of the Soviet Union in the early 90s. And estimates are that his confiscation of grain, his attempt to collectivize agriculture in Ukraine and seize property from productive farmers, all of that led to the deaths of at least 5 million Ukrainians. Some estimates put it closer to 10 million. Who knows? I don't know if you've seen the movie, but maybe 3 or 4 years ago, a movie came out called Mr. Jones. It is a very faithful dramatization of the Holodomor and the good work of a Welsh journalist named Gareth Jones to go inside, illegally inside Ukraine to find out what was going on. And it was his reports that led to the discovery that Stalin was engineering a massive liquidation of Ukrainians, largely through starvation. So, Mr. Jones, great movie. The producer of it, by the way, happens to be Polish,
Oh, interesting.
Agnieszka Holland. Yeah, so I think she wanted that message out there. And it's a very good film, great acting, and it's in English.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to mention that because we obviously talked about Polish skepticism as it relates to Russian or former Soviet intentions and their historical acts that inform their current skepticism about their true intentions. That's certainly true in Ukraine as well, given
Yeah.
their treatment they received from the Soviets and the atrocity of the Holodomor.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Unforgivable blot on the history of mankind. All unnecessary, orchestrated entirely by Joseph Stalin and the Soviet regime.
Yeah. So you've expressed obviously a deep personal connection to Poland, calling it a country that you love nearly as much as your own. How has their response to the war in Ukraine deepened or changed, if it has, your admiration for the Polish people and the Polish country?
The Polish response to what's happened in Ukraine has made me appreciate them as a people all the more. Their courage, their humanitarianism, their wisdom in looking ahead to understand what allowing this aggression to go unchecked might mean. I think the Poles are once again to be admired. They're stepping up to the plate, doing their part, and pressuring others to do their part. And the result, I think, is going to be a much better armed Poland because they don't want this to happen to them. So I admire the Poles ever more with each passing day.
And obviously, as you mentioned, there's a genuine and a worthwhile debate about what involvement the United States should have in the war in Ukraine. I think obviously the silver lining in our involvement is that maybe it did buy the time for the European countries to step up their game. Unfortunately, it seems like they've been dragging their feet for far too long. But Poland, I think, has set a great example for what many of the other European countries should be doing. And so hopefully they learn their lesson and don't let their guard down, so to speak, going forward.
Yeah, that's right. And I hope that President Trump will back off some of his pressure on Ukraine and step up the pressure on Putin. Sometimes I wonder, whose side is he on this? I mean, there's so much of what he's doing I like, but in this area, he hasn't been outspoken enough against Putin and what Putin's track record has been and the nature of his regime. Now, maybe he's talking like that behind the scenes. I don't know. But publicly, at least, Donald Trump ought to be out there saying, hey, if you don't stop this aggression and agree to a settlement that Ukraine can support, then more power certainly to Europe to do whatever they want to do to stop your aggression. He needs to be saying some pretty strong, powerful things against this rotten regime in Moscow, maybe even stoking up resistance within Russia by praising dissidents who courageously resist Putin's regime.
What do you think about, number one, the recent exchange where Zelensky visited the White House and this negotiation of a minerals deal in exchange
Yeah.
for defense guarantees? Do you have any insight on that or any thoughts?
Of course, all I know is what I see publicly. I think the way that unfolded in the White House was very unfortunate. That if Vice President Vance felt at some moment that Zelensky wasn't sufficiently appreciative, at least that's what they say was what started the conflict there. That's when they should have said, "Okay, we're done with the public portion of this. Let's resume our discussions in private." But to dress him down in public like that, I thought was a little disgraceful and very unfortunate. That's not to say that they didn't have some good argument, but they should have done that, if necessary, privately, because Zelensky, with all his faults, has really been on the cutting edge of resisting one of the more evil regimes on the planet, and I don't want to undermine him. So I thought that was unfortunate the way it rolled out in such a public way.
I'm a little bit skeptical too of the providing defense guarantees
Yeah.
because that
Oh, yeah.
also, I think, obviously that those can be made with conditions, but
Yeah.
I'm also skeptical about basically guaranteeing our involvement in future potential conflicts where we may not have the same interests. But I don't know all the details on those, but on those guarantees. But I'm a little bit skeptical about Trump's treatment of both sides of this
Yeah.
issue.
Yeah. The minerals thing, it's really strange. I mean, if we're going to commit to Ukraine's defense, and that's a legitimate, debatable issue, I don't think you do it by just an economic deal whereby we get access to minerals, because how is that a security guarantee? Are we trying to say that, hey, Vladimir, if you ever bomb our facilities in Ukraine when we start extracting these minerals, well, that means war with us? Do we want to do that or say that? I don't know that the Russians would say, American presence in the minerals business in Ukraine is any kind of security guarantee. So it's just kind of murky to me, not very definitive, and it relies too much on the goodwill of a guy who doesn't have any.
Yeah. So, what do you think about in terms of a future outlook? How much influence does Poland have over the rest of Europe and sort of getting them to step up their game? And what will their role be in fostering a peaceful resolution in Ukraine and continued or maybe long lasting stability in Eastern Europe?
I think Poland's role and the weight that it can throw around within Europe is only going to grow. Its economy is, by and large, robust. It's one of the freer ones in the old Eastern European Soviet satellite region. It competes very well with much of the rest of Western Europe. And the fact that they have courageously stepped up to the plate regarding Ukraine, I think all of that says that this is a country whose influence is only going to grow. And for the moment, at least, I think that's all for the better. I think, there's some question about whether the present Polish government has been oppressive against political opposition and dissenting opinions, and maybe they need to fix that. But still, I think Poland is going to shine brightly for a long time to come, and
My
that's a good thing.
impression my impression, and I know very little about Polish culture or the Polish government, but my impression is that they are less progressive than much of the rest of Europe. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think so. I think that is fair, and a lot of that is because the rest of Western Europe. They've been a little more eager to adopt some kind of socialist model or mixed model because they never had socialism forcibly imposed upon them for very long, anyway, as the Poles did. I mean, they know what socialism is all about. They had it forced upon them at the gunpoint after World War II by the Soviet regime. They don't want anything to do with it. They think socialism, welfare statism, a lot of Poles anyway, think it's just a way of government amassing and concentrating its own power at the people's expense. They understand that better than much of Western Europe. So, well,
My impression, anyway, is that that makes them more resolute against foreign powers as well
yeah,
because they want to maintain that sort of autonomy and that culture in Poland. Like I said,
yeah,
I've never been there, but that's my impression as an outsider.
yeah. I think that's true. Look what they endured for so long, for generations, resisting. Russian occupation in the 19th century until they reappeared as a country. And then having to do it again when the Soviets rolled in 1945. So they have this long history of, of working for their own freedom and independence, getting it, fighting hard to preserve it. So that isn't something they're going to give up very easily.
Just a few last points I'd like to make or ask before we close up. If you had an opportunity to address the Polish people about their role in the Ukrainian conflict, what message would you share with them?
The first thing I think I would say is a big, hearty thank you. Thank you for not just sitting idle as Russia rolled over eastern Ukraine. Thank you for stepping up and helping Ukrainian refugees in the huge numbers you did. Thank you for rebuilding your defense capability and helping Ukraine in that way as well, in every way you can. Thank you for warning the West about the importance of standing up to aggression from the East. So I would start just by gushing a lot of thank yous to the Poles for once again being so deserving of great respect and admiration of free peoples everywhere. And then I think I would say afterwards, now don't forget, freedom is always a never-ending struggle. And even when you think you have it, you always have to work against the forces that are trying to undermine it. And those forces are not just unfriendly foreign powers, they're also people within your own midst who haven't learned the lessons about the concentration of power and who would happily trade what liberties you have for a bigger government at home. So stand courageous against not only foreign aggression, but against encroachments on your liberties at home as well.
I'm glad you brought up that point because Americans have a tendency to get caught in the rhetoric around whether it's China or Russia or the European Union or all the faults that these other countries around the world have, and sort of as a distraction about what's going on here domestically. And I think that there's so much we need to stand guard against
Yeah.
here to make sure that we safeguard freedom going forward. And in one great example of this, a lot of people and I don't know what your thoughts on this are, so we'll get your thoughts. But a lot of people just called him a grandstander, but I see that Thomas Massie has exemplified great courage in his role
Yes.
in Congress, standing up for freedom and for responsible government to the extent that government can be responsible anyway.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Tom. I have met him and talked with him, and I have great admiration for him. And whether you agree with him on everything or not, you have to understand the nature of the man, and that is he is for liberty as he sees it, and he's not backing down for any reason. And I'm so grateful that we have members of Congress, at least one, who takes that attitude. That needs to be understood better and defended. So that doesn't mean I necessarily agree with him on every vote he casts. I don't know. But I have no doubt that Thomas Massie does what he thinks is best on behalf of the liberties that make America exceptional. No doubt in my mind of that at all.
It's not the sort of courage that was required by Pilecki, but it's still an incredible amount of courage that it takes to stand up, even in face of criticism from the most
Yeah.
powerful man in the world, right?
Yeah.
When
More
Trump
power to
called him
him.
a grandstander.
Yeah.
And I think anybody who thinks that's what he was doing just hasn't been paying attention.
I'm sure there were people who called Patrick Henry a grandstander too, but I'm glad he was there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Larry, I really appreciate you coming on the show to talk about this, about Poland's perspective as it relates to the war in Ukraine. I really enjoyed our discussion in episode 40. This is episode 174 now, I believe. So quite a few episodes have gone by since we last spoke, but
I
it's
thought you
always,
looked a little grayer.
yeah, well, you know what? I also have a 15-month-old son at home now.
Oh
So
my gosh. Oh,
yes.
belated congratulations.
So that's a good development. I'll trade all of my colored hair for gray hair for that blessing.
Wonderful.
So anyway, it's been great to chat with you. I always enjoy our discussion. And if you would, just at the end here, plug where people can find more of your work. I know you're active on social media. You still
Yes.
write regularly and put out a tremendous amount of effort in the fight for freedom. So tell people where they can find out more about your work.
Thanks, Alex. Well, probably the one best place, simply because it's all my stuff from wherever it's published put in one place, would be my website, which is lawrenceureed.com. No punctuation, just LAWRENCEWREED.com, lawrencewreed.com. If it's published at Fee or American Spectator or wherever, I end up pretty quickly putting it on that website, so it's all there.
Okay. Well, thanks again. I'll certainly link to that in the show notes. I'll put that as the top link so that people can find your work easily. I think I follow it regularly. It's always great to reread even some of your articles. So I'll encourage people to go check out your work, and I'll link to that at the top of the show notes. So thanks again for the discussion, and thanks everybody for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe to help us spread the message of freedom. As always, you can find us on YouTube, Rumble, Facebook, and X at Forge of Freedom and at forgeoffreedom.com. Thanks again, Larry, for joining us. And thanks, everybody. Remember, until next time, you are the Forge of Freedom.
Thank you, Alex.